Today we will discuss the third and the most complicated principle, the principle which earlier Hegel and his followers, including Engels, had called laws. Now, this third principle, which I prefer to call so, is the negation of negation. Previously, it was written like the negation of the negation, following the German way of writing. But nowadays, the American writers have dropped the second negation. To our elders in India, for example, this second the was as important as the first one. So if somebody would say the negation of negation, they would just pounce upon him and ask, no, you are not right. This is the negation of the negation. But nowadays the problem with articles is not so important. Even in India, we write it more simply as the negation of negation. Now the problem is, Joseph Stalin, who wrote the chapter on dialectical and historical materialism, completely omitted this category. His study of dialectics altogether leaves, and you might even say a bookish word, eschews the use of the term the negation of the negation. But in Hegel, it is as much important as the unity and struggle of the opposites, or the other one, the transition from quality to quantity. Now the fact is that this negation of negation means something that is quite self-evident and need not be explained at length. Let us first start with the idea of negation. As in language, so in logic, this is a very important aspect of being, what things are and what things are not. So when we say the pot is full, we also admit that there is a situation when the pot is not full. This negation is not. No, not, and such like words always denote the absence of something. So the negation is as good as absence. The problem is, in formal logic, as also in everyday conversations, there is a tendency to take this being or non-being, the presence and absence, as something universally valid, something that has been true in the past, is true in the present, and will be true in the future. So if the pot is full, it is full, and that is how it would remain. But such is not the issue of dialectics. The dialectics would call you to observe the situation when the pot is not full, and what is full now may be empty afterwards. Emptiness suggests the absence of some material in it. And that is how this negation has been a part and parcel of human understanding of events, of past and present, and also for the prognostication, foretelling of the future. This is going to happen, this is not going to happen. Such is the approach that is taken by the foretellers. Now, the problem is, this negation is something that people understand and actually practice in everyday terms, in everyday conversations, in writings, in grammar, in logic, and everywhere. But Hegel moved one step forward. He suggested that things move, they don't stay put. So, what is now presence may turn to be absence, and what is now absent may turn to be present. And that is how, in the course of time, the relationship between presence and absence is dialectical. We always have this kind of negation of what is once negated. So you have to view things in terms of what is there and what is not there, and at the same time, what will not be there and what will be there. And this is the logic of circumstances, that things do not remain the same. They go on changing. And the process of changing can best be understood in terms of the negation of negation. History provides us with the best examples. Sometimes there are royal dynasties who believe that they will continue to exist, that their progenies, their sons and daughters, will continue to be the kings and queens of the future. So they call this dynasty something that is permanent, that is going to stay. But as we know in history, no dynasty ever stays the same. Either it is lost to the foreign invaders or the dynasty dies of itself. Some old zamindars of India believed that they have a duty to perpetuate their own progenies by having sons and daughters to be elected as their successors. If there was no son or even no child, they would adopt someone in order to continue the same family and its prestige. But as with the royal dynasties, so with these petty zamindars, no continuity was always observed. In fact, with the abolition of the zamindari system, for example, the whole idea of the zamindar and the system of zamindari itself has been obliterated. So, in the course of time, you remember that in the British rule, they used to say, the sun of the empire, British Empire, will never set. Unfortunately, after saying this for, say, a few decades, the empire had to find its sunset years. And after the Second World War, the whole process of losing one colony after the other was a reality. So this idea of colonizing countries and thereby having their power enlarged was ultimately negated. But this is not the end of history. After the negation came the negation of negation. A new ruling class, a ruling party, or ruling power as a whole arrived. And that too will not remain the same. In larger perspective, you may think of world history, particularly European history, and you can find the same example of the negation of negation. In the earliest time we know there was no class, but that was not a classless society, it was a pre-class society. But after a few years, a few means in history's terms, a few millennia, you have slave society in Greece and Rome. There are slaves here, slaves there, slaves everywhere. Even the task of teaching children was entrusted to the slaves. And that is how the system of slavery continued for hundreds of years. It was not just domestic labor as in India. There were slaves and slave markets, but that was domestic. But here in Rome, in Greece, slavery was the prevailing social system. But did it continue forever? Aristotle had thought so. He thought that unless we have slaves, we cannot have the society. He wondered if the machine could run itself, if clothes could come out of the toiling people without, if the clothes could come out of the loom without any toiling people, then of course we could think of slavery. Unfortunately, Aristotle could not think of the whole system being changed so radically that there will be machines. Although we use the word manufacture in the sense of machine facture, actually human hand and machine are not the same. And when the machines started producing things, the need for slave labor was also lost. This was not the end of history, as I said. After slavery, there came a system called feudalism, where the slave was no longer bound to a master, but he was bound to the land. It was the handcuff of the land, as one Bengali poet called it. And that is how the feudal system continued, without any slave market, without people being bought and sold, and being permanently won by the master. You now have landlords, barons, and the king is just the primus inter pares. That is the first among the equals. He is also as much a landowner as the other landowners are, and of these landowners, the king stands first. The barons owe allegiance to the king, but they are not like the old slave masters, masters of slaves. They of course have these peasants working in their fiefdoms. And when there was a war, the king would call upon them and they would send these peasants to fight for the land. That is how the whole crusade was fought. But this system of feudalism also did not last long. It continued for more than 1,000 years. But ultimately, with the change in the means of production, with the increase in the means of production, with the advent of machineries, the whole system of feudalism had to succumb to capitalism. So this is how we might say this change of whole social systems in terms of first a negation, then to be replaced by another system, and that system too is negated. This negation of negation thus is a universal process. And the third and last law or principle of dialectics.